our systems thinking fellowship presentation. Obviously it's me and Taylor as well. She will start, like as Melissa said, in the background, or actually in the middle, I guess. So we had Priscilla and Melissa both as our mentors, basically, that helped us move along to our question and decide the story itself. So I will go ahead and start. We began first asking ourselves what we saw was actually happening and what were our key events or crises that were happening. So we actually settled for these challenges that we see in managing and acquiring private easements and land for conservation. So this is what we started out with as our events. We moved forward with our trends and patterns, which Taylor will go further into and show the graphs and the data that we actually found to back up these trends. But the trends that we saw were rising numbers of at-risk species, landowner median age, decrease in natural habitat, mistrust in government agencies, an increase in land values, and a decrease in profitability. And that's profitability of the land itself. So beyond those trends and events, we see this structure. And I wish we would have broken it down a little bit further, like the Texas A&M did, because I really enjoyed how they put those into categories. But our structure included confusion among programs or a lack of coordination and information on program overlap and scope, the incentive programs that are available, landowner demographics, size of ownership, and distinguishing between land trust types, which create incorrect perceptions. So after we were able to identify our events, see the trends and patterns, see the structure, we then lastly asked why these trends unfolded the way they did, and basically came up with this question. So why do challenges in land rights or land acquisitions for conservation persist? And just in case not everyone is aware, but acquisition is the process of buying. So the sentence is basically asking why there are challenges persisting in buying land rights and or land itself for conservation purposes. So with this, I will now pass the presentation over to Taylor, so she may give a little bit more detail on the trends and events that we actually found within some data.
Perfect. Amanda, do you mind just clicking through?
Yeah, I will.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
No problem.
Yep, so I'm going to be taking over and going over the major trends we wanted to cover from that story that Amanda just went over for us. So this first graph we got from the literature we were reading, and simply it's depicting the major land uses in the United States from 1949 to 2012. So we focused in on the non-ag and ag land, and it's showing basically in some from the literature that we pulled this graph from, it was depicting major conversions of land. So Priscilla provided us with some really great statistics that are up there for you. So we found that 6,000 acres are converted daily, and 1 million of those acres are added to urban environments per year. So we're losing that wild areas. So this was another major driver in our story, was that we were losing species, and that the number of threatened and endangered species were increasing over time. So we have 60% of threatened and endangered species are on private lands. So the issue with this is that we're not able to manage them as easily because they're on these private lands. This is one that we've talked about quite a bit, and it's in our loop diagram that we've started. Seeing these oh, yep, there it is. Seeing these numbers or more species get added onto the threatened and endangered species list is one of the main drivers for acquisition of land from a conservation standpoint. But the struggle with that is how are we going to manage these species on private lands, on private sector? So we made quite a few archetypes, and when we sat down in the group to talk, we pulled out a couple that we learned in Texas from the workshop. And when we sat down making our presentation, that would be best to simplify it. And and kind of dissolve those set archetypes, structures, and just kind of give an overarching diagram that we felt really emphasized our story. Some of the outside pressures that you can see that we were adding to the lack of cooperation included a lot of mental models, which we discussed quite a bit. That included the mistrust, but that could include age of producer, monetary means, land ethics, willingness to sell, other pressures that maybe aren't so measurable or are hard to find in the literature right now, but we thought it was important to note within our loop here. You can see our hours aren't as refined as we'd like them to be, but I hope that it makes sense so far. I don't know, Amanda, if you wanted to jump in back on going over the loop diagram.
Well, we really didn't. There were a few variables that we had found that we weren't exactly sure where they fit in exactly, and Taylor named a few of them from our outside pressures. But I mean, Taylor, if you wanted to go through each one, like the need to protect private habitat, and then go through each one.
So we started with the need to protect private habitat from a conservation standpoint. So we said as the need to protect private habitat increased, the pressure for private land / land right acquisitions would increase. As that increased, private regulatory compliance would decrease. That would decrease the mistrust of land acquisitions with a delay that the mistrust would build up over time. Then as the mistrust of land acquisitions decreased, lack of cooperation would also, mistrust increased, lack of cooperation increases, conservation practices on private land would decrease, and then the number of species of conservation need on private land would increase. We thought the need to protect private habitat also correlated directly to private regulatory compliance. So this is it definitely needs to be developed further, but this was a simplified overall idea of our main variables that we found in our question.
I think that's all that we have available as of this far. Any and all advice would be helpful. I know that we've been developing over this over the last semester, and we have, I think, really broken down the story pretty well. But any and all advice, we would love an outside perspective that haven't been staring at this for the past semester. So anything that y'all see that you think that we should add in regards to maybe where some of the things that Taylor mentioned could fit, or if there are things that y'all thought about as we were going through our loop, and maybe that you can just see that we didn't add in there and that we didn't think about, or maybe just overlooked, we would appreciate it.
All right, so we'll open it up to questions from the students or feedback.
So I have one question. So in that loop diagram, did you identify any balancing or reinforcing loops?
So we started that. We started with the balancing and reinforcing. This loop diagram has actually been manipulated quite a number of times. So we actually just took those out to start because we honestly didn't even look at the archetypes. We tried, that's what was our first mistake, is we tried to fit them into the archetype, not realizing that we should have just created a loop to begin with. And not even, like Taylor said, just dissolve the archetypes completely until we further develop this loop diagram. We didn't put any into it as of right now. Taylor, I know that you talked about it before, adding these in.
I just lost internet. I missed the question.
Oh, about our balancing and reinforcing loops, like identifying these here.
Oop.
So what the question was, Taylor, was did you guys consider any balancing or did you identify any balancing or reinforcing loops within the diagram?
Yes. So when we originally made it, I just cut the end. We pulled out some of those major archetypes like fixings that backfire.
Right.
And, now I'm blanking on the escalation.
Yeah.
And we did have balancing and reinforcing loops within this. So the main one, I believe, I'm trying to look through my notes. I believe the balancing loop started with the need for conservation to protect habitat. Directly correlated to the increase in the need to purchase lands for that conservation practice. I'm trying to think now. I'm sorry, I don't have that loop right in front of me, so I'm trying to do it right off of memory.
I mean, I guess if we were just
the backfire was creating that mistrust between the landowners.
Right. I mean, I guess if we were just to look at it as of right now and just go through it, if obviously this right here would be a balancing. I think that is that what your question was whether we just put the balancing and reinforcing in?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, if we just went through it and just made this here or this here and then full circle, I think what we were trying to do before we put those in is there was just quite a number of variables that we weren't sure where to fit them in at, and I know that would definitely change how those balancing and reinforcing would be present in the loop diagram itself. But we will definitely, as we progress, and especially since when we get this program, I think it would definitely help us create more of a balanced and reinforcing kind of look. I know ours is just kind of like there right now, but that is, I definitely have that written down. So I appreciate you pointing that out.
I also have like one more thing. So I'm sorry if I'm wrong, correct me. But the way I see it is between all of your variables, there is a huge time gap, right? So if the number of species of conservation leads to need to protect the private habitat, I think like there is a huge dilemma between those, like not only those, like most of the variables. Like a delay time. So none of, so most of the loops have more delay time. Or so if you have like one thing, like let's say conservation practices of private land, for that to go into the reduced or increased number of species conservation, it takes a lot of time, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
No, that's a good point. I don't.
That's correct.
I have talked about that too much, actually, adding in those delays. Yeah, no, that's definitely something we should consider. Because this is something that takes quite a long time for all of these variables. Not just the mistrust to build up, but purchasing the land, the need for it over time. Yeah, that's definitely something.
The longest would now be.
I was just asking the question because I don't see like anything in short term, like any fix in the short term. So all of the fixes that you have or all of the variables that you have in the long term, you don't have any short term solutions or things like that.
I guess it's because of the scale that the problem is being considered. We're looking at it almost at national level. So within that, to look at short-term solutions, which tend to be, I don't want to say county specific, but I'll go as far as saying state specific, depending on local state regulations, is where you'd have the nitty-gritty being depicted as short-term solutions. But for the most part, national trend is to go towards easements, to go towards land trusts buying land or government agencies directly buying land.
But that is a good point, though, the short-term solutions. That is a good point. That's something to,
sorry.
no, go ahead.
Can you give me an example what private regulatory compliance means? Or what's an example of a, what regulations are you talking about compliance with?
When we first, oh yeah,
No,
you can
no.
go for it.
No, I was literally saying, Taylor, you were about to say something.
Okay. So I believe when we first put that variable in before it was refined with both our mentors, we just had regulations and policies that are put in place once conservation organizations or NGOs purchase the land. You know, that there can't be construction within a certain, you know, however many feet, or there, you know, you can't build, or any kind of just regulatory policy that would be in place in order to protect that habitat and protect the endangered species that are present there.
And that would be from the owner of the easement or owner of the land that's acquired it for to keep it, you know, for conservation purposes. From
Right.
the landowner side, when we're talking of the regulatory compliance, this comes at play if there are at-risk species identified on that land.
Right.
So what regulations would they be subject to under, say, the Endangered Species Act? So if there's an endangered or threatened species on your land, you are suddenly bound by the rules and regulations in place to cause no harm to the species or its habitat. So if, let's say, you are a private forest landowner and the forest on your land is your source of income as timber, you are suddenly seeing regulatory compliance impacting your income source. The question then becomes, what is the alternative? Do you ignore compliance and chop everything down, sell it off as fast as you can? Or do you find ways of being compliant to regulation, conserving the species, but getting incentives or getting tax benefits to compensate? Does that help answer the question?
Yep, it does. I just needed an example, like the example of endangered species on land, or I've seen that come up in water quality rules.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think because I was thinking about this too as they were presenting, and I didn't catch it before, but you know, private regulatory compliance versus conservation practices on private land. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. The private regulatory compliance is more compulsory, whereas conservation practices on private land would be
voluntary.
Voluntary,
yeah. The idea would be for landowners to want to participate in conservation action before they have to be forced to do something. So there's an, I guess that goes back to the issue of trust. Landowners typically don't want federal government coming in and telling them what to do. So that can also feed into the mistrust we have there.
And I think that's where it stems from originally, that we said once how are we going to, that relationship is breaking down over time between the landowners and these NGOs, because you know they don't want to say that there's an endangered species there, because their whole operation has to stop. There'll be compliances that are dealt with, and we that's how our whole project kind of started going, and that mistrust that's just increasing over time from you know, there's two different goals there. There's private landowners that are, you know, making a living, and then there's conservation organizations that are trying to do their job, and they're both, you know, there's just separate goals. Whether they, you know, I think see the other viewpoint or agree with the other viewpoint, they have a job to do, I think, and I think that's what's creating that tension.
And people are people, right? And they may want, one neighbor may want to give his land up for an easement, but the one next door doesn't. So overall, it can be just a quarter of the habitat that's involved in an easement, but the other 3/4 isn't. That has impacts down the line too.
So I have one more question. Does What do you see as the trend in land value? I guess for a region or whatever scope it is you're focusing on, what's been the trend in land value, and does land value play a role in this diagram?
Land value play a role in which realm?
Does land value play an
Mhm.
important role in this diagram?
Oh, sorry, Taylor, go ahead.
Because it's
I,
about acquisition and value, or the
right.
cost of the land. Seems
Right.
like it might be an important
Yeah.
part of it. And so is it embedded in here? And I just
And I think it might have been brought up in the iceberg coach, I believe. And I know this is something Priscilla would be the best to answer this one. I think she explained it to me, but how as the land is becoming more precious for that we're losing habitat every day, and we want we need to get back from migratory pathways, endangered species habitat. That the demand, as the demand goes up, the price will go up, and same for private landowners as well. So as we're both reaching for this land, the price can keep increasing in value, and that that's going to put pressure on both parties.
Yeah. So unfortunately, even if the whole story is being considered at more of a large scale approach, we're looking at it at nationally and very generalized. There are certain variables that are relevant at county level. Land pricing is the major one. It varies so much just at the level of the county. The best Amanda and Taylor can do, and the rest of us, for this story, is to just show the broad trends, but not necessarily be able to fit in the smaller level intricacies of how land pricing would operate. But just as an example, if within a certain county, competition is between developers buying a land versus a land trust acquiring it for conservation, then it will, for the landowner, it will be who's the highest bidder, usually. So the pricing set on one lot will automatically impact neighboring lots. And what the value of those neighboring lots will be will depend on, will then impact what's the intended use, whether developers get it or whether a land trust is able to acquire it. Now, there are other factors that come into play. If we did mention landowner median age. So older landowners who want to pass the land on to the next generation, they have to consider the size of the land and the value of the land they are passing on. Because for those inheriting the land, inheritance tax and estate taxes will come into play. And those can be quite an economic burden on some families. The question would then become, do I sell the land off to a developer and get rid of that inheritance and estate tax as fast as possible and sort of get compensated for it? Or do I inherit a land that has a conservation easement on it, knowing that the easement automatically reduces the value of the land because it's a lost development? So there are those aspects that they do have the information on, they just haven't gotten to the point of showing it on the graph yet, and that should come out in the next couple of weeks.
So, if I may, I would like to know, back to the first one, the different points on the mistrust of the agencies. I want to know what was the thought or the reason behind that bullet point.
I guess for that, Amanda, you should talk about APR a bit here. They are the perfect example. Yeah, go for it.
So you're talking about this one right here, right? The mistrust in government agencies.
Yeah. I guess I want to know the kind of the thinking, because behind it, or maybe also an example of how mistrust in land government agencies lead to loss of land, or
Right.
changing hands, whatever.
So just like Priscilla mentioned, I definitely probably a great example for you. So the American Prairie Reserve, Montana, they are a private nonprofit organization whose ultimate goal is to create the largest reserve in the continental U.S. So they basically came in with this goal of 3.2 million acres. There are a couple of neighbors directly to them that understand what they're doing. They don't quite agree with what they're doing. However, they're seeing that what they're doing is fine. I mean, it's obviously good for the environment, all of that. So they're fine. However, they are getting so much opposition, or I guess oppression, from these middle people who are seeing them as land grabbers. And they're actually putting out signs that are saying, don't buffalo me, don't land grab, things like that. And they're actually having anti-APR, American Prairie Reserve, organizations come about, which is creating this mistrust. Now, they actually did a survey in Montana, a statewide survey, that said the people very outside of the APR zone didn't know who they were, but once they found out, they actually agreed with what they were doing, thought that it was great, and thought that what they had going on was great for the environment, for the West, to keep it, the prairies and all that. But the people in the middle, basically, the middle people, did not. It was the complete opposite. They knew exactly who they were, and they did not think that what they were doing was good or anything like that, which created this mistrust, because APR is, quote unquote, trying to save or restore the natural prairies. And their literal slogan on one of the anti-APR organizations is "Save the Cowboy," which has that, idolized American West kind of look to it. So that's not the only example that we found. There are plenty of examples that we found in literature. I'm sorry.
Mistrust in, I know it didn't exactly answer your question, and the idea is that, I just saw the question. APR is private, but the idea of mistrust and land grab is something that's been historically present, because private landowners don't always understand land rights, especially if they have a split estate. So there have been plenty of documentation on cases happening where the government owns mineral rights to private land, and they can come in and take the land, literally grab the land, because of eminent domain. So that mistrust is pre-existing, and it just sort of gets translated to organizations that may actually have a relationship with federal and state agencies, or even if they don't, they get thrown into the same lot.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, because also, if I may, quick question, because I think yesterday or day before yesterday, I was reading a news article where it lists the 50 top landowners in the U.S. You can look it up, and the only one I remember is this guy from Google. What's his name?
Turner?
Whatever Amazon guy. He owns like 450 million, 1,000 acres, somewhere in that area, 450,000 acres. And I wonder if these big corporations are just, y'all mentioned land grabbing is one of the factors, in reducing this acreage, could be, because there's like 50, top 50 in the U.S. Of course, a lot of them in Texas, Montana, the big states like that. But I'm wondering if this is one of the reasons or factors, or it could be a variable.
It gets tricky. My understanding of US law is that a corporation is considered an individual. So in some of the papers we've been reading, when they talk of private land ownership, private can be by an individual, a family, or a corporation.
A limited partnership thing.
Any corporation. So Bank of America is considered a private landowner if they have forest land that they haven't yet developed. And sometimes they own forest land because they did a development on other land of value, and they acquired the forest land as a way of compensating for the development and the damage done there. But they are still considered private landowners, and there's still the same conditions of private land ownership will apply to them as well, even though economies of scale won't.
Yeah, so different, yeah.